I'm going to do threaded rods today. I probably should have done them sooner, but honestly, between gluing the individual rings together and then doing some plastic welding on the back side of the seams, everything is really stuck together well. And I haven't, as I've been working on it and sanding it and painting and filler, there's no like cracking sounds or anything or seams that have opened up, so it's holding together really good just with glue. But this Mark III design, part of why it's able to be lighter is that it's designed to have four threaded rods that go through all three of the rings, and then tighten bolts top and bottom that help hold the rings together. And I just trying to figure out a way to make them smooth on the bottom. I just haven't got around to it. I'm using 8/32 threaded rods because here in the US it's easier to get that than it is metric, which I forget the metric size that they recommend in the instructions, but yeah, I can just go down to local hardware store and pick up 8/32 threaded rods, and they fit just right in the channels, and then I don't have to order metric rods. So what I'm doing here, and this is just all experimentation that I've messed with, I found just some 8/32 nuts that I had in my collection of various nuts and bolts. And what I've done, I don't know if it'll show, is I've actually gone over with a Dremel rotary tool with a sanding drum on it. And I have sanded the tops of these bolts down so they are a lower profile than they originally were, so they're not as thick. So when I push them all the way down into these slots, they will be countersunk just a bit. They won't be sticking out. So my plan is I'm going to use some 2-part epoxy. I tend to use old CDs that had stuff on it that I've redone or whatever, and as a mixing tray, and a little screwdriver to mix it up. And I am going to put epoxy in this hole, and then I'm going to push this down, and that's going to draw the epoxy down and hopefully glue this threaded rod into this first ring. I figure I shouldn't ever need to pull the threaded rods out. So once they're in, they're going to be permanently in, hopefully. And then I've left them all up a couple inches like that so that I can put epoxy into that recess, push it down. I will get some kind of a tool, probably the aluminum rivet I was using for some other stuff. I was gluing magnets, so I can push that all the way down so it's in that cup, and so some of the epoxy will get on these threads and go down into the hole with the threads, and then I'm expecting to have to use some more epoxy to actually build this area up so it's a little bit over full. Just a bit. I don't want to have to sand too much, which is why I probably should have done this earlier before I did any primer on it. But hopefully the epoxy in that opening will also form around the nut and over the nut and hold it in place good enough that when I tighten the nuts on the other side, the top of the body, these will just be held in place by the epoxy and won't spin, and so I can then tighten the ones on the top. and these will end up being flush between the epoxy, and then I'll sand it flat, and then I'll use filler if there's any slightly low spots, and then I'll prime back over it, and hopefully by that point they'll be locked in place. They won't move around or crack the paint, and they'll be down recessed with enough epoxy over the top to make sure everything is locked in place, fairly level, and then primed over it. And when painted white, the most hopefully that will be there is maybe a little bump if they don't quite get all the way down flat, or maybe a little recess if I don't get them filled with filler, although that's probably not going to happen. What's either going to happen is they'll be flush and you won't see them, or there'll be a little bump where they ended up being just a bit tall and I wasn't able to get them perfectly flush. One thing I don't want to do on the bottom is take the rotary tool with a cutoff wheel for risk of screwing up the bottom, although again it's the bottom and filler would fix that, but I'd rather not do that, getting metal shavings in with the plastic and all that. So I want to make sure that these aren't too far down when I glue them. I want to make sure that they're on there with enough threads that they're going to hold, but that the bolt isn't sticking up above the nut. So everything's pretty much flat across the top. So that's my plan. I'm going to go mix up the epoxy now and do it, and I'll probably, after I've got them epoxied in, I'll show the end results of what they look like, and I won't really know how good it works until they are firmly dried and I try tightening a bolt where they come out the other side. Where they do come out the other side, there's a... Yeah, I'll just show that later. I won't talk about that since you can't see it, but yeah. So that's it for this part of the video. Okay, what I have done seems to have worked. Not quite maybe as well as I had hoped. I've put the epoxy in, and as I moved the threads down, I was hoping the epoxy would go down and be drawn down into the first ring here, but it really didn't seem to pull much down, and it's because probably these threaded rods are fairly close to the diameter of the channel, the hole for them, so it didn't pull all that much epoxy down. It did, so I pushed it down about an inch, all four of them, and then another like half inch, and then pushed them all the way down. I used same aluminum rivet I used when I was gluing magnets in, because you have to push the magnets down to get them down into the recesses. But obviously if you do it with anything magnetic, like a piece of steel, the magnet will just stick to it and come right out. So an aluminum rivet I used to push them down, and then I filled the channel, got epoxy on the end of my screwdriver, and put it all on the top so that it had a slight dome. Not that it's spilling out over the edges, but that it's so that it was definitely filling the area around the nut. And then just because you can't quite tell if it's getting in all the way around the nut, I took the sharp hobby knife and basically kind of did a poking motion all the way around the nut to make sure that epoxy was getting all the way down there, and hopefully if there were any air bubbles trapped, then by moving this up and down all the way around, it would break those air bubbles free. Something that also might be helping today is it's another day in the Pacific Northwest that's going to possibly be record temperatures for this time of year. So it's going to be supposed to be like 90 something degrees. So that should help the epoxy be more liquid and flow into the openings better. So yeah, that's the first part of this done. I'll just leave it here overnight for that to set up, and then there's the top bit that I didn't talk about when I started this video, the first half of the video. Obviously, this is the top of the droid, and there's a ring called the top ring that sits in the top, and it goes over where the threaded rod sticks out. So I cut the rods a little bit longer than they need to be just to make sure that they weren't too short. It's easier to cut it off after the nut is applied, even though I didn't want to do that on the bottom. I'll do that on the top. That's why I've got these 2x4s holding the body up, because all four of these threaded rods are sticking out a little bit below, there you go, below the line of the body. So the top ring sits inside here, and it's a little tiny bit recessed from the actual top of the body. And then I haven't determined what kind of nuts I'm going to put on that. I went to the hardware store today. I posted on astromech.net. Is it .net or .org? I posted on the Astromech site into Jason Charlton's build log. He's building the same Mark III cut files, and he's got an excellent build log. And I asked the question of when he put his threaded rods in and how he did it, because the top ring has recessed area around the nuts, kind of like the bottom, but I can't. It's too small for my socket to fit over a nut to tighten it. And so he showed that he's using nylon lock nuts, and they do stick out a little bit above the body height, but the Lazy Susan, I guess, covers that. So I'm not sure if I'm going to use that. I went to the hardware store today and I got nylon lock nuts, and I was searching around because the ones that he shows are smaller in height than the ones that I had on hand. And so searching Ace Hardware, I found ones that were the exact same height, and then I just kept looking and I found some that were a smaller height but still 832 size nylon. So I've got those, and those look like the same ones that Jason uses compared to his pictures. So I haven't decided if I'm going to use those or if I'm just going to use just plain flat nuts like I did here, but in that case they wouldn't need to be shaved down because the recess I believe is a bit bigger on the other side of the droid than it is here on the bottom side of the droid. So haven't figured out exactly what I'm going to do there, but this is the first part, like I said, getting these glued in, and hopefully that will be strong enough to lock them in place so they won't spin. If they do spin, it's probably not going to be the nut that spins, it's going to be the nut and the epoxy that are going to spin in that round opening. So hopefully that doesn't happen. And I don't expect that they have to be super duper massive tight. Like I said, the glue is really holding the rings together well so far. So I think as long as it's snugged down to the point where the nuts don't work themselves loose or whatever, I think that's going to be fine for the additional support. There are also the shoulders. You can kind of see one through there. The shoulders also get the same threaded rod, but they go from about the same height here because the shoulder piece will go in, and they'll go from the top of the shoulder piece into the rings and then out this hole here, and that's where the other nut will be. So they are a shorter length rod. So the threaded rods that I got at the hardware store were long enough that when I cut these four, I had enough leftover rod that it's going to be more than enough to make it for that shoulder joint. And so there's one on each side, so you need two threaded rods for each, so that's four, and there's four here. So by buying the four threaded rods, I have all the threaded rods that I need. So that's good that I don't have to worry about getting any more threaded rods. One thing I've read is people wonder this angle when you're putting the threaded rod into here, that's not flat. So how do you tighten it if it's not flat? And there's a couple things people do. One of them is you don't worry about it. You just go ahead and tighten it, and even though it's at an angle, so it won't be the nut won't be flush against this surface. It'll just be on the high point. It'll still be enough pressure to hold that in. And the other thing they do, which I think is a really cool idea, is they heat the nut up here, and then they pull the threaded rod, and the nut melts its way a little bit into this plastic. And so once you've pulled enough for the nut to melt its way down, like the width of the nut or the height of the nut, then it'll basically make itself a flat surface. So that's a kind of cool idea. I might do that. But first issue is, of course, getting these done, because I am nearing painting, and these should be done before I paint it white. Although I guess I could have waited and then just hand painted that area white with whatever method I choose. But like I said, this method, I'm really hoping that I can just sand those off and fill and primer it and paint it white, and hopefully they won't even be noticeable. And while I'm here and filming and babbling on, the worst seams on my droid are on this back panel piece, this side and the other side of it. And so I've been working on it, and you can see, hopefully you can see that this one is a lot better. It's still a little bit thick there, but it doesn't have a really extreme curvature to it. It's just that I've been making it thinner and thinner instead of filling that and then chiseling or drilling or sanding the entire channel back to the right size. I've just kind of been adding filler to the areas where it is bowing out a bit, and then slowly working on it, trying to get it level. And it's to the point now where, I mean, I think that's pretty good as far as I could just go with that. I might try to do a little bit more, but that's really close. And then the other area over here is looking pretty darn good. Those seams are really, really good. I don't see anything obvious with the camera or my eye where those seams are bowing out or look super crooked or anything. So I think I'm in a really good place as far as my seams go. I'm happy with that. So again, this primer all needs to be sanded before I'm ready to do the white coat. And you might see some different colors in here. So that's a combination of, I primed the whole thing, and then I've done a little bit of work on the seam with the glazing putty, and then spot sprayed with some more primer. So I've done some sanding and some extra spraying, and that's why there's multiple different colors going on here. I'm a little bit worried about this. This is a seam between these two rings, and that one might actually be visible once painted white. There was a height difference. These are small pieces that go in there, and they were the ones that didn't quite line up very well. And I've tried a lot of filler and sanding and spending time on that, trying to get that a smoother transition, and it feels pretty good. Not perfect, but just standing back with a camera and being able to see a line there, I'm a little bit worried about that. But I think it's going to be okay. So, yeah, that's about it for this. Like I say, I'm not gonna be able to do anything with that. I'm gonna have to let it dry overnight before I do anything else. Okay, this is the second or third part of this video, I think. I'll have to make sure once I put it together that I find all the right parts. This is the end result of gluing in the bolts from the threaded rods that go through the body. There's 4 of them. One somewhere over there, one somewhere over there. So, previous video, I ran the bolts up there, and I had the nut right near the end, and then I had epoxy in the hole. So there's a hole, threaded rod goes in, nut goes on the end, and then epoxied over the whole thing. And then I took that outside and I sanded the epoxy down flush with the bottom. And then I used some filler material after sanding it, and sanded it again, and then now I've got some primer. It's not perfectly flat, so I might sand the bottom of this with 220 and see if it's bad enough I actually care to fill it with more filler to touch it up. It is the bottom of the droid. My main thing was that I didn't want the bolts to be sticking out and visible if I could avoid it, and I've pretty much, I think I've done that. If there's anything, it might be a slight bump or even a slight depression in those areas. There's definitely no bolts sticking out. My main worry, of course, is when I tighten the other end of the bolt, is it going to make this end spin? Is the epoxy just going to break loose and spin when I try to tighten the threaded rods? Which will mess up the paint in a circle and make it so I don't know how I'll be able to tighten it, because it'll be moving on this end and the other as I tighten the other end. So that won't be added to this video unless that happens. I'll show that it happened, but I'm not sure at what point I need to tighten them down, because the top ring goes on. So I think after I paint this white, then I put the top ring on, and then I can tighten those bolts. I think. Or I could put the top ring on, tighten the bolts. Well, because these data port, the blue piece has to go in before the top ring goes on top of it, so the top ring doesn't get stuck in place. It needs to go on so that the blue data port panel piece fits in here. So it needs to be removable. So yeah, I don't really have to cut those bolts quite yet, so that they're flush with the body on the other side. So anyway, yeah, last part of this 2 or 3 part video. Again, I did the other ones earlier, and I can't remember how many parts I did, if I showed what I was going to do or if I just showed the glue when I was gluing them in place. and the end results, or end results of the glue anyway. So here's the end result of after the epoxy, sanding it flush, adding a little bit of filler, sanding it flush again, and then priming it, which will get it close, but I noticed that it wasn't quite flush. So I might need another filler and primer, but we'll see.